August 25, 1944. A narrow French road outside. Avranches lies buried beneath a haze of dust and diesel fumes. The summer sun hangs low, turning the drifting clouds into a dull, orange veil. On a ridge above the roadway, a group of German staff officers stare through their field glasses, watching the Americans push eastward in long, even columns. To them, the scene looks predictable. Slow trucks. Thin supply lines. Exhausted men. A logistical tale stretching so far back it seems impossible to sustain. One officer lowers his binoculars and smirks, convinced that the U.S. Army's advance will choke itself before it ever reaches the German frontier. Fuel shortages, he believes, will do the work his divisions no longer can. But then the rumble begins, a deep, rolling thunder from the west. Continuous, growing, not a column a stream. Headlights glowing even in daylight, engines roaring without pause, tarps snapping, tires slamming against broken roads. Truck after truck, it's an endless river of olive-drab steel rushing forward without hesitation. What the German officers witnessed that day is the beginning of something they have never seen before, and something their supply-starved armies are not prepared to face next. In the weeks after the breakout from Normandy, the character of the war in Western Europe changed almost overnight. What had been a slow, grinding struggle through bocage, hedgerows erupted into one of the fastest pursuits of the Second World War. Operation Cobra had torn open the German line in late July 1944, sending American and Allied forces pouring through the gap with a momentum no one fully anticipated, not even their own commanders. By early August, entire German divisions were collapsing. What remained of the 7th Army was retreating in fragments, leaving destroyed equipment and abandoned fuel drums scattered across France. Paris was still in German hands, but the defensive coherence required to hold it was rapidly dissolving. American units under Generals Omar Bradley, Courtney Hodges, and especially George's Patton surged eastward with an energy that seemed unlimited, but it wasn't. As us mechanized forces pushed deeper into France, their supply lines stretched dangerously thin. Every mile gained on the battlefield demanded more gasoline, more ammunition, more rations, and more spare parts. Patton's Third Army, moving faster than any American army had ever moved in Europe, was burning fuel at a pace no conventional supply system could sustain. The problem began with the ports. Cherbourg had been captured, but the Germans had destroyed its infrastructure before they fled, leaving the Allies with only a fraction of the unloading capacity they needed. The great ports of Antwerp and Le Havre, still in German hands, remained beyond reach. Railroads had been bombed relentlessly during the pre-invasion air campaign. Bridges were down, locomotives were scarce, and what few rails survived were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer volume of men and material pouring into France. This left trucks as the only viable means of supplying the rapidly advancing armies. But the U.S. logistical system had not been designed for a 400-mile pursuit across the heart of France. Motor transport companies scrambled to adjust, piecing together supply routes using whatever roads were available. At first, these efforts worked. Small convoys moved cautiously from beach depots toward the front, delivering enough fuel to keep armored divisions moving. Yet within days, it became clear that the situation was approaching crisis. American armored divisions were outrunning their supplies. Sherman tanks reached villages, where French civilians greeted them with flags and wine, only for the crews to admit that they had barely enough fuel to continue to the next town. Infantry regiments found themselves rationing ammunition that was supposed to be plentiful. Engineers struggled to clear roads choked with wreckage and refugees, and all the while, German officers watched from afar, convinced that the Allied advance was self-limiting. They believed the Americans lacked experience in deep operations. They assumed the logistical buildup required for a sustained drive toward Germany would take months. Some German analysts even predicted that the U.S. Army, overloaded and overextended, would be forced to pause before reaching the Seine, in their view. The Americans had muscle, but no way to feed it. What they did not yet understand was that the U.S. Army had the organizational depth, industrial power, and raw manpower to attempt something radical. something no army in Europe had attempted at such scale and speed, a continuous high priority. Round-the-clock truck route dedicated solely to supplying the front line at a pace matching the advance itself. The seed of this idea was taking shape. Inside the Allied Logistical Command as early as mid-August, officers of the Transportation Corps recognized that the only way to maintain the momentum of the breakout was to create a supply artery that never rested. Fuel from Normandy depots needed to flow east without hesitation, without interruption, without getting tangled in the chaos of post-battle France. But designing such a system was one thing. Building it while the front shifted daily was something else entirely. Roads had to be selected, cleared, marked, and reserved. Guard points established. Maintenance depots positioned. Traffic controlled, with absolute discipline. Thousands of drivers, many with only minimal training, had to be mobilized and organized into disciplined convoys capable of operating day and night. As August turned to September, the demand for fuel rose even faster. Patton signaled Bradley repeatedly. He could advance deeper into France. Someone could keep his tanks fed. Hodges needed ammunition for the push toward Belgium. Every American field commander felt the same pressure. They all understood that the German army was on the run, and if the Allies could maintain momentum, the war in Western Europe might end months sooner. But momentum depended on gasoline, and gasoline depended on trucks. This growing tension between what the front demanded and what the supply system could deliver formed the crucible in which one of the most ambitious logistical operations of the war would be born. The breakthrough across France forced Allied logisticians to confront a simple truth. The battlefield had expanded faster than any plan anticipated. The carefully prepared supply doctrine for Operation Overlord was built around beach depots and gradual expansion. Nothing in the doctrine accounted for an American army suddenly leaping hundreds of miles into open territory. Yet that was exactly what had happened. By mid-August 1944, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force SHAEF faced a logistical dilemma with two possible futures. Either slow the advance to rebuild supply lines and move that would give the German army precious time to recover, or find a way to feed a modern mechanized army at unprecedented speed. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, responsible for orchestrating the entire Western campaign, understood the stakes immediately. A pause risked losing the advantage the Allies had fought so hard to achieve. The responsibility for solving the crisis fell largely on the communications zone, known as COMZN organization, tasked with moving everything the fighting armies needed. At its center stood General John C. H. Lee, a strict, methodical officer whose logistical vision was often criticized, but whose results were undeniably effective. Beneath him worked the Transportation Corps, led by officers like Major General Frank Ross and Brigadier General Ewart Plank, who now confronted the most urgent supply emergency of the European campaign. Their solution was both bold and simple. Create a dedicated express route, supply highway designed solely for the movement of trucks hauling fuel, ammunition, rations, and spare parts from the Normandy depots to the fast-moving front. It would be operated around the clock, guarded, regulated, and prioritized above all other traffic. The plan required manpower on a scale few had expected. Thousands of truck drivers were pulled from support units, engineer battalions, quartermaster companies, and even stateside replacements, not yet assigned to combat roles. Many of these men were African American soldiers. The U.S. Army of 1944 remained segregated, and most black troops were placed in service and support roles, event though they carried immense responsibility for the war's outcome by late August. African American drivers made up roughly 75% of the personnel assigned to the operation. They were handed keys to 2.5-ton GMC trucks Iconic Deuce and a half vehicles and ordered to run supplies at all hours. Often under blackout conditions, through territory still marked by retreating German units, snipers, and mines. The risks were real, but the need was greater. Yet manpower was only part of the challenge, as the route itself had to be carved out of a battered landscape. Engineers surveyed roads across northern France, choosing paths wide enough for convoys, and close enough to depots and forward dumps to maintain the necessary flow. They settled on a looping system. One road for loaded trucks heading east, another for empty trucks returning west. No civilian vehicles allowed, no cross-traffic, no stopping except at designated points. It was a radical concept for a war zone, and one that demanded absolute discipline. Military police companies were stationed along the route at intervals of a few miles. They controlled intersections, enforced speed limits, guided convoys at night, and kept civilians from wandering into the supply artery. Fuel depots and repair. Stations were positioned to keep trucks moving as constantly as possible. Mechanics worked without pause. Breakdown teams stood ready to push damaged trucks aside to prevent bottlenecks. Every detail mattered, because the front was starving for fuel. Patton's Third Army consumed gasoline faster than any force in American history. Some armored divisions burned tens of thousands of gallons per day, more than entire cities in peacetime. Without a constant controlled supply stream, the tanks would stop. And if the tanks stopped, the German army would regroup behind the Rhine. As the plan took shape, its designers understood that success would not be measured in miles or victories, but in tons. Tons of fuel delivered, tons of ammunition pushed forward, tons of supplies that determined whether an army advanced or halted. On August 25, 1944, the same day German officers smirked at the slow American convoys, the operation was officially given a name, the Red Ball Express. Its insignia, a bold red circle on a white field, soon began appearing on signs and vehicles from Normandy to the German border. And within days, what began as an improvised solution would transform into the single lifeline of the Allied advance in artery-pumping strength. Into the front lines at a pace the German high command never believed possible, the moment it became operational. The Red Ball Express revealed the many angles, human, tactical, mechanical, and strategics, that shaped its intense and often dangerous existence. For the men who drove the Red Ball Express, the war was not measured in battles or front lines, but in hours of darkness, the smell of hot engines, and roads that never seemed to end. Most were young, many barely out of training handed. The wheel of a 2.5-ton truck and told that the fate of entire armies depended on how fast they could move. They drove through nights so black that even the outline of the hood disappeared, guided only by dim convoy lights and a faint glow of stars above shattered. French towns, fatigue became their constant companion. Drivers pushed through 14 to 20-hour shifts, sometimes sleeping upright in the cab during brief halts, the engine still idling beneath them. Road hazards were everywhere. Mines, washed-out bridges. Ambushes from isolated German stragglers and civilian carts drifting into the lane. A single mistake could send a truck off an embankment or block an entire convoy. For African-American soldiers, who made up most of the drivers, the experience carried a deeper weight. They served in a segregated army that often denied them combat roles, yet entrusted them with the logistical lifeline of the entire Allied advance. Many faced discrimination at depots and rest camps, but on the road, the mission erased barriers. Their courage, endurance, and skill kept Patton's tanks moving and the American push alive. Every driver understood that if they faltered, the front would feel it immediately, and so they pressed forward, tired, hungry, but unbroken, carrying the war on their shoulders mile after mile. The Red Ball Express was not merely a stream of trucks, it was a carefully orchestrated, tactical system as disciplined as any battlefield maneuver. Its strength came from coordination, speed, and strict adherence to procedures that left no room for improvisation. Every convoy departed on schedule, with spacing calculated to prevent bunching. Military police controlled choke points along the entire route, ensuring that nothing interfered with the flow. Convoys were organized into serials, groups of trucks departing at fixed intervals, led by a guide vehicle that set the pace. Drivers were ordered never to break formation, never to stop unless directed, and never to leave the road under any circumstances. Roadside repairs were performed in minutes. If a vehicle suffered a major breakdown, it was pushed to the shoulder so the convoy could continue. The tactical rule that defined the entire operation was simple. The road belonged to the Red Ball Express alone. No civilian carts, no wandering jeeps, no competing military traffic. This protected the rhythm of the convoys and ensured that trucks moved at maximum sustainable speed even in darkness. Engineers and MPs treated the route as if it were a living supply artery. Obstruction cleared instantly. Every crossroads guarded. Every signpost marked in bold red to guide the drivers. On paper, the system looked rigid. In reality, it was fluid, adapting daily to shifting battle lines, damaged bridges, and sudden traffic bottlenecks. The tactical discipline built into the Red Ball Express allowed it to function under pressure few other army systems could withstand. 2 German commanders. Trained in a doctrine that prized rapid movement and decisive maneuver, the American advance initially seemed unsustainable. Their intelligence summaries routinely noted U.S. logistical strain, particularly shortages in gasoline that were slowing armored divisions as early as mid-August. For a brief moment, German officers believed the Allies had overextended themselves. Some even predicted a pause near the Seine, giving time to rebuild defensive lines. But as the Red Ball Express began its continuous run, German analysts were forced to reconsider. Reports filtered in from reconnaissance units describing endless truck columns moving day and night. Headlights dimmed but visible in long ribbons across the French countryside. Prisoners spoke of an unbroken river of supply vehicles supporting the American armies. Luftwaffe pilots, low on fuel themselves, occasionally caught glimpses of convoys stretching for miles more trucks than they could ever hope to interdict. Meanwhile, the German logistical situation collapsed. Fuel dumps destroyed by Allied bombers could not be replaced. Trains lacked locomotives. Horse-drawn supply units struggled to keep pace with retreating divisions. As American mobility increased, German mobility declined sharply. Inside the Wehrmacht, the smirks faded. Officers who once mocked the Americans for being too dependent on fuel saw the consequences of facing an opponent that could feed its machines without pause. While German panzers sat immobilized, American Shermans kept advancing, powered by a supply network the German High Command no longer underestimated. By early September, it was clear the Red Ball Express had become a strategic weapon in its own right. The backbone of the Red Ball Express was not a single truck, but an entire family of machines pushed far beyond their intended limits. At the center stood the GMCC KW, universally known as the Deuce and a Half. Built for rugged reliability, it became the workhorse of the operation. Hauling everything from boxed rations to volatile gasoline sloshing inside 750-gallon trailers, the trucks were durable. But the Red Ball, routine, constant motion, rough roads, overloading placed enormous strain on every component. Engines overheated under the August sun, brakes wore thin on steep descents. Tires shredded on roads filled with debris from retreating German units. Drivers quickly learned to perform field repairs with whatever they had: scraps of wire, strips of rubber, improvised clamps. Maintenance crews operated around the clock, crawling beneath chassis still hot from the road, replacing head gaskets, tightening drive shafts, and swapping out engines with lightning speed just to keep convoys rolling. Every truck was marked, inspected, and sent back into the loop as fast as possible. Idle vehicles were a luxury the operation could not afford. The mechanical philosophy was simple: fix it fast or move it aside. Salvage teams recovered broken trucks only when the route was clear. Priority always rested on the flow, not the individual vehicle. The mechanical demands turned the depots into hives of organized chaos, welders sparking under canvas shelters, fuel drums lining open fields, and engine blocks stacked like building stones. And through it all, the trucks kept moving, delivering lifeblood to the front even when their own systems groaned under the weight of war. Behind the roar of engines and dust, choked roads, stood a circle of leaders whose decisions transformed a desperate supply crisis into a functioning logistical marvel. At the top, Eisenhower set the strategic tone. The advance must continue, and the supply system must adapt. The pressure he placed on COMZ was immense, but necessary. The tempo of the war hinged on momentum. General John C. H. Lee, often criticized for rigid administration, found himself responsible for executing a plan with almost no margin for error. Beneath him, General Frank Ross and Brigadier General Ewart Plank molded the transportation corps into a finely tuned instrument. Their planners mapped routes, calculated tonnage requirements, and set standards for convoy discipline that would shape every mile of the Red Ball Express. Leadership challenges came not just from strategy, but from internal friction. Combat commanders wanted more fuel. Depot officers needed more time to load. Engineers demanded road closures for repairs. MPs insisted on strict traffic control. Every decision had consequences. Leaders had to balance the urgency of the front with the physical limitations of vehicles and men. Yet despite the strain, the system held together because its leaders shared a common understanding. The front would collapse without supplies. Communication between depots, road teams, MPs, and field commanders became relentless. Orders shifted daily. Logistics officers rode the route personally, inspecting choke points, counting breakdowns, and pushing units to meet impossible timetables. This web of leadership, tense, disciplined, and unyielding, kept the Red Ball Express pulsing long after ordinary systems would have fractured under the pressure. At its core, the Red Ball Express represented a strategic gamble that placed extraordinary pressure on the soldiers who made it function. Commanders knew the risks: exhausted drivers navigating blackout roads at high speed, trucks carrying gasoline through ambush-prone territory, vehicles pushed past mechanical safe limits. Every mile carried danger, and every decision weighed human cost against strategic necessity. But the stakes were too high to hesitate. The entire Allied strategy depended on exploiting German weakness before the Wehrmacht could re-establish defensive cohesion behind the Rhine. Every gallon of fuel delivered kept American armor moving. Every ton of ammunition delivered sustained the relentless pressure that forced German divisions into retreat. Logistics was not a background operation. It was the decisive factor shaping the battlefield. Morally, the strain fell heavily on the drivers, many of whom served in segregated units that received little recognition at the time. They took the same risks as frontline troops, often with fewer protections and far less acknowledgement. Yet their actions had a strategic impact unmatched by many combat units. They enabled the mobility that crushed German hopes of stabilizing the front in late 1944. The tension between human sacrifice and strategic necessity defined the Red Ball Express. Yet those who drove it understood the truth with stark clarity without their effort. The offensive would slow, the enemy would recover, and the war would drag on. Their endurance became a form of courage, quiet, uncelebrated, but essential. As September approached and the pressure on the front lines intensified, the operation would reach its decisive phase, a moment when speed, supply, and desperation converged. By early September 1944, the Red Ball Express was no longer an improvised solution. It had become the central artery of the Allied advance, its pulse measured not in hours, but in tons of supplies delivered. Every day, more trucks poured onto the route. Every night, convoys moved under blackout conditions, their dim blue lights forming faint chains across the French countryside. On September 2nd, the operation reached its peak. More than 6,000 trucks were on the road, each one carrying fuel or ammunition for armies now pressing against the German frontier. The scale was unprecedented. No modern army had ever attempted to sustain a pursuit of this speed and distance through motor transport alone. But the U.S. Army had no choice. The front was too far ahead, the rail lines too damaged, and the opportunity too great to slow down. Patton's Third Army felt the urgency most intensely. His divisions were poised to strike at the Moselle River and push toward Germany's borders. But a single day without gasoline could halt the entire offensive. Field commanders sent urgent messages to the rear, demanding fuel in quantities far beyond anything the depots had previously delivered. Every time a Sherman tank idled, every time an armored column paused to regroup, Patton's staff watched fuel gauges with rising anxiety. The Red Ball Express answered with speed. Convoys left Normandy at staggered intervals. maintaining a rhythm that could not be broken. Drivers rotated in shifts but rarely slept more than a few hours at a time. At staging points, MPs directed trucks with hand signals so fast they blurred under floodlights. Mechanics leaned over open engines, tightening bolts and adjusting carburetors while sweat dripped from their hands. In the glow of lanterns, depot crews rolled gasoline drums down wooden ramps, loading trucks until the axles sagged every minute mattered. The front demanded 400,000 gallons of fuel per day, and the Red Ball Express had to deliver it. Road hazards multiplied as the pace increased. Convoys sped past burned-out German vehicles, their twisted frames still warm from recent fighting. Bridges built in haste trembled under the weight of constant traffic. Dust clouds swallowed entire convoys during daylight hours, reducing visibility to a few feet. At night, a wrong turn could send a truck plunging into a ditch or colliding with another vehicle. Yet the trucks kept moving, the pressure from the front leaving no room for hesitation. Then came the moment when the stakes became brutally clear. On September 7th, Patton's tanks stalled near the Moselle. Fuel was depleted, and the armored spearhead had no choice but to halt. German forces, though battered, saw an opportunity to rally defenses along the river. A pause of even 24 hours might allow them to anchor a new line, one that would cost the Allies weeks or months to break. The Red Ball Express surged to meet the crisis. More convoys were dispatched than ever before. Drivers ran through the night, some barely able to keep their eyes open. Fuel trailers rolled over patched bridges that groaned under the strain. A few trucks skidded off narrow country roads, their cargo lost to ravines or roadside craters. Mechanics worked without rest, dragging broken vehicles aside and plugging gaps in convoys before traffic could snarl. At dawn, as mist lifted from the fields near Nancy, the first wave arrived. Gasoline was pumped into waiting tankers. Shermans refueled where they stood. Commanders mounted their vehicles before the engines even cooled. By mid-morning, the Third Army was moving again, that single resupply made possible only by the relentless pressure of the Red Ball Express prevented German forces from stabilizing the Moselle line. Patton's armored columns rolled forward, smashing through weak points and widening the breach until German resistance fractured once more. The psychological impact was profound. German reports noted with alarm that the Americans seemed able to move without stopping, an ability the Wehrmacht no longer possessed. But as the front surged toward the German border, the demands placed on the Red Ball Express grew heavier still. More tonnage, more fuel, more miles of dangerous roads. The climax of the operation was still ahead, where momentum would collide with exhaustion. And the fate of entire offensives would balance on the ability of truck drivers to deliver one more load. By mid-September, the European landscape had transformed into a living artery of war. The Red Ball Express thundered day and night, its engines screaming, its headlights carving white tunnels through the night fog. Every hour, every mile, every gallon delivered pushed the Allies closer to Germany's heart, but the final surge was the hardest. Rain turned roads into mud. Fog smothered visibility, tires skidded, engines overheated, and drivers running on coffee and sheer will fought to keep their trucks upright on narrow, twisting French lanes. Breakdowns were constant. Ambushes, occasional fatigue. Universal, yet the convoy never stopped, as Patton's armor surged toward the Moselle and Hodges. First Army prepared for the assault on Aachen. The trucks pushed harder than ever. Drivers who hadn't slept in 36 hours gripped their wheels with shaking hands. Mechanics crawled beneath broken axles in the dark, fixing trucks by the light of cigarette embers. Military police struggled to keep the routes clear as thousands of vehicles crowded the roads, like metal veins pulsing with life. And then, in the last weeks of September, something extraordinary happened. Fuel dumps once empty overflowed. Ammunition stacks grew taller than the tents that housed them. Artillery commanders stopped rationing shells. Tank crews filled their vehicles to the brim and loaded more jerry cans on the holes, for the first time since DAJ. The Allies were no longer chasing the front lines, they were driving them.
When the guns finally fell silent and Europe began crawling out from under the rubble of war, one truth remained undeniable. The Red Ball Express had carried the Allied victory on its wheels. In just 81 days of operation, its drivers, many barely out of their teens, moved more than 400,000 tons of fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, and hope across war-torn France. Without their nonstop convoys, Patton's armor would have stalled in the hedgerows, the push toward Germany would have slowed to a crawl, and the liberation of Europe might have taken months longer. But what the history books often forget is the human story. Most of the Red Ball Express drivers were African-American soldiers serving in segregated units, young men who were denied combat roles but given a mission that demanded courage equal to any battlefield. They raced through enemy territory, dodged air attacks, ran roads so narrow that mirrors shattered on stone walls, and drove until their hands bled. Many never received the recognition they deserved, yet they kept going, because they understood that every mile delivered, every gallon of fuel hauled, every crate of ammunition stacked was pushing Hitler's armies closer to collapse. Their bravery powered the tanks that broke the Siegfried Line, supplied the divisions that liberated Paris, and kept the Allied flame burning when it nearly flickered out. Today, the roar of their engines has faded. But the legacy of the Red Ball Express lives on. Not just in military history, but in the courage of the young men who refused to stop.